All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Mainly Hoops podcast, where we're diving into week 2, doing some takeaways, some buy-sell segment, game of the week. But we're going to kick things off with Cody. Cody, what are your key takeaways from week 2?
Yeah, obviously, I mean, there's a lot to take away. It's the first week of serious college basketball games. I mean, obviously the any game is serious, but just the really high profile matchups obviously started the week with Kentucky, Louisville, and Illinois, Texas Tech was obviously two fantastic games. But I mean, my main takeaway is just how great Gonzaga has been. I don't think anybody really took them all that seriously as a real title contender going into the season. They came into the season at 21st in the AP poll or something like that, and they look all the way legit, really, on both ends of the floor. And I'm most impressed with how they defended, particularly against Creighton. They had them in hell in the second half. Really, obviously they came out of the gates a little bit slow, but the defensive changes they've made, at least from a personnel standpoint, like adding guys on the wing and tying Grant Foster or getting to retain him was huge. Jalen Warley playing more Emmanuel Innocenti has kind of changed the dynamic for this Gonzaga team that was, kind of a step behind on the defensive end. Like, we always know that the offense is real with them, and they have the elite post-up offense with Graham Ike and Braden Huff and Mario St. Superi and Braden Smith have kind of masked the loss of Ryan Nembhard to an extent. Obviously, it's going to be really hard to replace Nembhard fully, but those two guys handling the point guard duties by committee, and more so Mario St. Superi playing more time has been really massive for Gonzaga. So, it's just kind of a yearly reminder that Gonzaga is going to be in the national conversation, as they are every year. I just think people kind of forgot, and this team is all the way legit, sitting at number 2 in KenPom now, which is pretty crazy. I don't really think people perceive them still as a top 3 team in America, but I do think this is a team that's going to be right back in the national conversation again.
Marcus, any key takeaways from you?
Yeah, I'll just speak to that real quick. I was one of those doubters to an extent. I knew Gonzaga was a good team, but I was a bit of a doubter coming into the year. But, it's not necessarily just been, that they've won these games against Oklahoma, Creighton, Arizona State. Granted, those aren't national powerhouses, but they're power conference teams who, for the most part have good programs. But it's been how dominant they've been in these games, right? I mean, the Oklahoma game, they really just pulled away, and it stayed that way against Creighton. They in the second half, they really dominated them. Kind of started end of the first half, but like you said, Graham Ike has been fantastic. Huff, of course, but Ike's really been the go-to guy down there on the block. 18 points. He's also hit some threes. Again, the Creighton game, he led off the game with 3 straight threes. So, if he's knocking that down, that really, of course, opens things up for him. But one of my key takeaways from this week was about Michigan. And I have some – we've talked about this concern quite a bit, but I think it ultimately could be their perimeter shooting that leads to them. I think it puts them in trouble of getting knocked off by a double-digit seed in March. Their lack of perimeter shooting, yes, their front court's gonna dominate. With the 3 guys they have up front in Lindeborg, Adai Mara, and Morris Johnson. But this week they made 5 threes against TCU, and I think they made 4 against Wake Forest. And honestly, Wake Forest had no business being in that game. As many free throws or as often as Michigan got to the free throw line in the first half, I don't know the exact number. They shot 37 free throws in that game and won by 1 point. The entire Wake Forest team just about fouled out in the first half, it felt like. And they still, Wake Forest managed to get back in the game, outscored Michigan by 13 in the second half to send it to overtime. But really, this Michigan lack of perimeter shooting, I think, is going to end up being a major downfall for them, because it's hard to beat the best of the best and it puts you on major upset alert come March if you don't have guys that can knock down shots. So that was one of my key takeaways this week. Both of those games against TCU and Wake Forest ended up being way closer than they should have been, which leads me to believe that, this is going to be a real issue as things continue.
Yeah, a lot of good games on this past week. I mean, we had Kentucky, Louisville, Bama, Purdue, UConn, and BYU last night. What was your game of the week, Cody?
I would say, I mean, obviously there was a lot of fantastic games this past week, but I would say Illinois and Texas Tech was probably my favorite game of the week. It was just a lot of fun offense in that game, and it was kind of at the expense of some leaky defenses. With Texas Tech, they just looked tiny compared to Illinois. Illinois has a ton of positional size. It's not a Texas Tech team that really isn't that small.
No.
You have like Atwell and Bryan on the wing, like they're supposed to be plus positional size guys like Tyree Bryan 6'6" wing, like Donovan Atwell's listed at 6'5". I highly doubt that he's 6'5". He looks like rather small out there on the floor. And then, you had to play JT Toppin out there at the 5 for a lot of minutes, which is like kind of my main concern with this team until Luke Bamgoy comes back is, can this team protect the rim at a high level, protect the paint at a high level when JT Toppin's playing the 5 over his natural position at the 4. But this game, kind of had it all. They had just a ton of shot making. JT Toppin was ridiculous in this game. He was super efficient. Yeah. I mean, Illinois, like they kind of opted to single cover him for the most part and kind of take everybody else away, which they did a rather good job of that. But Toppin was just getting anywhere he wanted, that 5 foot, push shot, hook shot, whatever you want to call it. It feels like it's going to go in every single time. He probably it's him and Trey Kaufman-Red who probably have the best touch with that type of shot in the entire country. It's probably like the best that I've ever seen. So very impressive on the offensive end. They have some defensive stuff to work on, but Illinois looks pretty ridiculous on the offensive end. They're bringing Andrei Stojakovic back into the mix. He looked really good, scored 21 points, was hyper efficient, got to the rim really at ease. So then they weren't even at full strength, which is kind of the crazy part. They were without potentially their most talented offensive players in Thomas Lavovicic and, the point guard from the Adriatic League, Mihailo Petrovic, who we haven't even seen a minute of yet. It's the guy that averaged 14 and 7 in the Adriatic League. And this is a team that's not even with their point guard right now. So I think the ceiling for this Illinois team is rather high. I think the ceiling of this team is Final Four to a national championship type team. They really do look the part right now, particularly on the offensive end. They have some defensive stuff to work on. They're a little bit slow footed, I guess, at some positions, but ultimately I think their positional size can kind of figure that stuff out. But that was a really awesome game to watch. A lot of high level stuff, a lot of high level shot making and offense in general.
Yeah, great game. Couldn't agree more. I mean, both teams were as advertised. JT Toppin was phenomenal. Marcus, what was your game of the week?
Yeah, one quick thing on Illinois as well. I think it's kind of going understated quite just how good Kylan Boswell has been. He's been incredible. I mean, their last game against Colgate, he didn't do a ton. He struggled from the field, but he had 22 against Texas Tech. He's been getting to the foul line. He's been shooting the 3 super efficiently outside of last game against Colgate. And like Cody said, they're missing 2 key pieces on their team right now, and he's really stepped up. And he's their veteran guard leader here. And so I just don't think you can understate how good he's been.
And Boswell's he's making shots now. The last couple of years, before last season, he was a 39% shooter and a 37.9% 3-point shooter. Had a bad year last year, 24.5%. Everyone kind of wrote him off. And so far this year, he's 10 for 23 from 3. Looks really good. And he's not even playing his natural position right now. He's playing point guard. And, when he gets slid into that 2-guard position, playing his natural role with Petrovic operating as the main ball handler, he's going to be put in even better spots. So I'm pretty impressed with what I've seen with Boswell as far as a bounce back is concerned.
Marcus, I'll let you take it away with your game of the week.
Yeah, I'm gonna go with that BYU UConn game, and it was really shaping up not to be the way that UConn was dominating, for a good chunk of the game. I think they led by as many as 20, right? I think it got close at least. It was between 18 and 20. But BYU really kind of found something, clawed their way back in. They had some energy there. Of course, AJ DeBanza being the hometown kid, there were a lot of BYU fans in the crowd, although, there was a huge UConn crowd as well. But the atmosphere was cool. They played on the parquet at TD Garden, ended up a 2-point game. This game was really fun. We saw what AJ DeBanza can really be down the stretch, right? He hit some really tough mid-range shots like we talked about. He takes some tough ones, but he makes them. Richie Saunders was really good down the stretch, had some really tough finishes going to his left. I think we saw something that we touched on a bit in the preseason with UConn that is continuing to maybe be a little bit of a problem again, and that's taking care of the basketball. Like this BYU defense is typically a defense that doesn't put a ton of pressure on their opponents, and they were able to turn UConn over 16 times. And I think they may have found a little bit of something with that pressure they were putting on UConn to get back in the game. They really forced UConn to speed up at times and throw some pretty errant passes to help them get back in the game. But for me, that's a little bit of a concern with UConn. We talked about it, as I said, in the team preview coming into the year, and we saw it against the team that typically doesn't turn other teams over, which leads me to believe it could be an issue moving forward. So I think there's some things to figure out still with ball control for UConn, but this game ended up being really fun, kind of back and forth at the end, really tactical down the stretch. It was, cool to see some of the sets. They ran that set, BYU did, coming out of the timeout, I think for Saunders on like the pin down on the left wing. I wish he'd just let that thing fly, but he did like the sidestep one dribble three instead and missed it. But those are like the kind of plays that you're looking for out of a timeout for Kevin Young. We joked about it last year, but it felt like just about every ATO resulted in a basket for BYU. So, it was a really, really fun matchup, great coaching matchup. Can't ask for much more in a game that was hyped up the way that it was.
All right, transitioning to our buy-sell segment here. I've got we're doing title contenders. I've got Kentucky starting out this first 2 weeks. Cody, are you buying or selling Kentucky?
Oh man, this is a tough one to start me with, man. But if you would have asked me this preseason, I would have bought all of the stock. But after watching the game against Louisville, the offense it doesn't look like your typical Mark Pope offense. There's not as many off-ball shooters as you would like on this roster, or as many movement shooters as you would like, mostly because they're not playing a lot of Cam Williams. I think they need to play a little bit more of him. And I know Pope has come out and said like he needs to be more aggressive before he gets more time. But I just think he fits in perfectly into the system as really perfect 3-and-D guy for this system. And obviously Colin Chandler has kind of emerged in his second year here. I mean, he's shooting at 13 for 23 from three this year, but they need a little bit more of that. And Owe struggled against Louisville. I'm not really all that concerned about that. I think he's going to be okay. I think Kentucky fans are kind of hitting the panic button, which I would say don't really do that at this point in time. And they're also just not healthy right now. Yeah. And Jalen Lowe, like there's real conversations that he might need surgery. I don't know if it's actually going to happen or not. I think they're trying to find other ways around it. But, if they're not healthy, if they don't have their point guard and they don't have as much off-ball shooting, and Jaden Quaintance comes back later than expected and isn't really the same player, which I think he's going to be when he comes back. Like I will say, I mean, I'm selling them relative to where I had them in the preseason. Like this was my preseason national championship pick, but the fact that they're already dealing with injuries and the offense has looked a little bit clunky in games against Nichols and a little bit against Louisville. They turned it on down the stretch in that game, but it makes me want to sell some stock in Kentucky right now.
Marcus, what about you? Anything on this? Any take?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely fair to not be buying as much stock, but I still think like I'm still buying relative to like the rest of the country. just because like this Kentucky team, like Cody said, it's not healthy. They're going to get Quaintance back. Like hopefully Lowe can figure it out, and they can figure out a ways around him having surgery, and he can be fine. But like you were saying, like relative to where we had them, 2 weeks ago, a little bit lower. An offense that's relying on, like, Aberdeen took 20 shots in that game against Louisville. Like that's too many for a guy like him. Granted, he had 26 and was efficient in that game, but that's too many. This Kentucky team, I'm not panicking on. Like you said, Owe is going to be better. He had 12 points in that game. He just kind of looked, I don't know what the word is, a little bit clunky in that game. He just never really found his rhythm. But overall, not worried about him. At the end of the day, he's going to be fine and be one of the best players in the SEC. As we move along into the season. But overall, I am going to still buy this team as a national title contender. I trust Mark Pope too much. I think they're going to be able to figure things out with the amount of talent that's on this roster. They lost one game against a really good Louisville team on the road. So no need to panic just yet. There's enough talent on this roster.
All right, Marcus, we're going to go back to you just, to not bombard Cody too much. But how about Michigan? Are you buying or selling Michigan? They had a close game and they haven't looked 100% like we thought maybe, but what are you thinking?
I've already kind of hinted at this. I'm definitely going to sell them as a national title contender. I think it just comes down to the perimeter group, right? They're going to play the three bigs a bunch, but you're relying on Elliot Cadeau to make shots. You're relying on Roddy Gale to make shots, LJ Kaysen, Trey McKinney. It's just not an efficient enough group for me. They're going to be really good on the boards, which obviously goes a long way. But, when you get deep into conference play against the best teams in your conference, when you're trying to go on a run in the tournament, like the perimeter shooting is going to come back to bite you. It also doesn't help that you're turning the ball over 16 times a game on top of that, right? That was another concern with this group, as it was last year, is taking care of the basketball. So, the perimeter group is just a little bit too shaky for me to be able to say this team can win a national title. Lendeborg's great. The front court's great, but I'm going to need to see more out of the backcourt to be able to put this team as a national title contender.
Cody, what are your thoughts here? Buying or selling Michigan?
It's a sell for me too. I was selling this team really before the season started, and granted, like these two matchups were fairly tough matchups for them, in my opinion, schematically. Like they had obviously far more size than Wake Forest and TCU, but their rim denial schemes, their ability to force turnovers, I think was really going to give this Michigan team a tough time, really, regardless of how good they looked at the beginning of the year. Like, they put up 121 on Oakland, and granted, they were playing a zone and could get any shot they wanted and get any rebound they wanted. So, but ultimately, Wake Forest and TCU set up pretty well. But the problem is Michigan's profile looks eerily similar to last season. Like, their turnover margin it's probably among the bottom of the country right now. They're 268th nationally in turnover rate offense, 283rd in turnover rate defense. And, you look at last year and it's pretty much the same, 324th in turnover rate offense, 268th in turnover rate defense. They still dominate the paint and dominate the glass, but they also don't really shoot the ball that well, as Marcus has mentioned. There's been a few bright spots, I guess, in the shooting department. Honestly, Elliot Cadeau looks a little bit more confident shooting the ball, and Trey McKinney's knocking down the three at a solid clip. You would like to see Burnett shoot it a little bit more often, really take advantage of his open looks. He's only taken 10 3-point attempts so far this year, but McKinney 8 for 18. But ultimately, I just don't think they have enough perimeter offense, and I don't think they take care of the ball at a high enough level to consider them a tournament team or a championship team.
All right, we're just going to do one more. What are our thoughts on Florida to start the season? Cody, buying or selling Florida as a title contender?
Man, you're really hitting me with the hard ones here. But, the Michigan one felt rather straightforward for me, but it's a sell for me on Florida because they really have a very similar profile to Michigan. So it's a lot of the same reasons. Like you look at their turnover margin, it's very similar. 238th on offense, 233rd defensively. They get all over the glass on both ends of the floor. They dominate the paint, but guess what? They can't shoot, and they haven't, or at least they haven't been able to shoot so far. They're shooting 21% from three in 3 games. That's good for 353rd in the country. I think the Tommy Haug at the 3 experiment, I don't think it's going all that poorly. I just think they don't really have like a second option to go in there and play the 3. Like they're throwing in some CJ Ingram minutes. He hasn't played a ton, and they've been playing, Urban Klobuchar has been sliding in. I don't know how many 3 guard lineups they've really gone with. I don't think it's been too many. They're also throwing Isaiah Brown in there for some minutes, but I just think the issues that we brought up in the preseason are really coming to the forefront right now. It's lack of shooting, and it's turning the ball over a little bit too much, and its depth and optionality really isn't there. They seem to be pretty one-dimensional at this point in time. And I guess one thing that has surprised me a little bit has been point of attack defense. I know Xavier Lee has been like he was always kind of viewed as the weak point on this defense, but Boogie Fland hasn't really cut it either. He hasn't really been all that great. And then when you're playing 3 bigs, like obviously the point of attack defense is going to be a fraction worse than if you're going to throw out like a switchable wing out there. So maybe it's a little bit too much on Xavier Lee and Boogie Fland when it comes to guarding the other team's best guard, because Rob McRae on what day was this? Tuesday. He had his way with this Florida team. He was spacing out the big, spacing out either Chinyelu or Condon, and he didn't even really need that switch, and he was just able to get to the rim really at will. And he's a really underrated player. I think he was one of the best or most underrated gets in the portal, but ultimately he really exposed this Florida defense in a way. So selling
him. Okay, Marcus.
This one's really tough because obviously like you can't discredit like national obviously some different pieces, but just like national title experience. But I'm going to sell some stock here. I just think that like Cody said, like 18 turnovers against Florida State. Like granted, Florida State I think has some personnel to turn teams over. It is a concern. They haven't shot the ball great. I expect them to shoot it better. They're not going to shoot it 21% all season long. But for me, it really just comes back to the depth of this team, right? Like we saw in that Florida State game in particular, 4 guys play more than 32 minutes and 3 guys play 35 plus. That's a lot of minutes on, a lot of guys. Coming off the bench, you had Klobuchar play 18 minutes, and then after that it was 10 for Handlogden and then 1 for Ingram and 6 for Isaiah Brown. They don't have the same depth. They don't have an Aberdeen coming off the bench. The guard depth, as we touched on in the team preview, is just not there, and it clearly shows that it's just not overly trusted. Last year having Will Richard, Clayton, Elijah Martin, and then Aberdeen to come off the bench, and then like Klobuchar is your 5th guard. That was pretty nice to have. Whereas now like Klobuchar is your 3rd guard, and we haven't really seen Lee and Fland mesh all that well together. I know like coming into the year we were a little bit concerned about that, and I think it's sort of coming to fruition a little bit. Their floor is going to be high just because the front court is so good, and so dominant on the glass. But I think I'm going to sell some stock in their national title hopes just solely because of the lack of depth up to this point.
All right, that wraps up week 2 for the college basketball season. As always, thank you for listening to the Mainly Hoops podcast.